He can't even stand anymore. Take the baby and leave him." Those words cut through the hospital hallway like a knife the night Daniel Cross lost everything. Once a powerful millionaire, Daniel now lay paralyzed from the waist down after a brutal accident, his fortune stolen while he was unconscious. His mansion seized his name, erased by men he once trusted. By morning, he was nothing but a broken man in a wheelchair holding his newborn son Noah with nowhere to go. Everyone walked away. Friends, lawyers, family. Everyone except Aisha Monroe. Aisha was the housekeeper they never noticed. A black woman with tired eyes and a quiet strength forged by years of surviving without safety nets. When security tried to drag Daniel out when former partners mocked his helplessness, Aisha stepped forward and said, "If he goes, I go. And the baby goes with us." That night, rain soaked the streets as Aisha pushed Daniel's wheelchair mile after mile, her arms shaking her shoes worn through. Noah crying softly against her chest. She sold the last thing she owned, her late mother's earrings, to buy formula and a cheap motel room. When Noah fell dangerously ill, Aisha carried him through the emergency room doors while Daniel lay helpless outside his wheelchair, broken, his pride shattered. And still she stayed. What Daniel didn't know was that his enemies had missed something, a hidden server buried deep in his old estate, filled with evidence of betrayal. While he planned a quiet comeback, Aisha risked everything, sneaking back into the house that had thrown them away. Because sometimes the person who saves your life isn't the one with power or money. Sometimes it's the one who refuses to leave when you've lost it all. Aisha Monroe did not stay because she was brave. She stayed because leaving would have broken something inside her she might never get back. When the lawyers stopped returning calls, and former friends crossed the street to avoid Daniel's eyes, Aisha moved quietly through the wreckage of his life, packing what little remained. She folded Noah's tiny clothes with trembling hands, whispering soft reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. At night, when the city outside their cheap motel window roared with indifference, she sat on the edge of the bed, rocking the baby while Daniel stared at the wall, silent and hollow. "I didn't sign anything," he said, once his voice cracking. "They stole everything." Aisha didn't answer right away. She knelt in front of his wheelchair, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Then they didn't steal your worth. They only took what you let them carry." Daniel turned away, ashamed. A man who once commanded boardrooms now needed help to reach a glass of water. He hated that Aisha saw him like this, hated that she stayed anyway. Security guards laughed when she demanded his belongings back. One even told her, "You're just the help." Aisha didn't flinch. She stood taller, shielding Noah with her body, and replied, "No, I'm his family now." Each day became a quiet battle. Aisha skipped meals so Noah could eat. She cleaned motel bathrooms for cash, then came back smiling as if exhaustion hadn't carved itself into her bones. At night, Daniel listened to her hum gospel songs while she washed bottles in the sink, the sound stitching something fragile back together inside him. For the first time since the accident, Daniel understood something painful and profound. Loyalty had nothing to do with contracts or bloodlines. It showed up when the lights were off, when there was nothing left to gain. And somewhere between the hunger, the humiliation, and the long, silent nights, a truth settled deep in Daniel's chest. He hadn't lost everything, because the one person who owed him nothing had chosen to stay. By the third night, the city had stripped them down to their smallest, weakest selves. Daniel Cross sat slumped in his wheelchair, on the sidewalk, rainwater pooling around his useless feet, watching people hurry past as if he were invisible. Car headlights cut through the darkness, splashing light across his face for a second, then gone. Once he had owned buildings like these streets. Now he didn't even own a place to sleep. Aisha Monroe didn't stop moving. She pushed the wheelchair through the rain until her arms burned and her back screamed. Noah bundled tight against her chest, his tiny breaths fluttering fast with cold. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she didn't slow down. Not when her shoes filled with water, not when her legs shook, not when Daniel whispered, "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she said quietly. "Because you can't." They found a motel that smelled like bleach and old sorrow. The clerk barely looked at them. One night. Cash only. Aisha nodded, reached into her pocket, and felt the smooth metal of her mother's earrings, gold hoops passed down through 3 generations. She held them in her palm for a long moment, then placed them on the counter. "Will this cover it?" she asked. The clerk shrugged. "More than enough." That night, Daniel lay awake listening to the sound of traffic outside and Noah's soft whimpers beside him. He watched Aisha wash bottles in the cracked sink, her shoulders sagging now that she thought no one was looking. He realized the cost of what she had given up, not just money, but memory history, the last piece of someone who had loved her first. The next morning, hunger followed them like a shadow. Aisha skipped breakfast so Noah could eat. Daniel noticed her hands shaking when she lifted the bottle, noticed the way she turned her face away when her stomach growled. "This isn't living," Daniel muttered, bitterness seeping through his voice. Aisha met his eyes, fierce and steady. "No," she said. "But it's surviving, and surviving comes first." As they stepped back into the streets, soaked, hungry, and forgotten, Daniel felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just poverty. This was rock bottom, and the only thing standing between them and complete collapse was the woman pushing his wheelchair forward one step at a time, refusing to let them disappear. The night Noah stopped breathing, everything fell apart at once. It started with a cough, small, weak, almost polite. Then another. By the time Aisha pressed her ear to his chest, his skin was burning, his tiny body trembling in a way no baby ever should. Panic flooded her veins. She shook Daniel awake, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong. He's not okay." They rushed into the street, the air sharp and unforgiving. Aisha pushed the wheelchair faster than it was ever meant to go, rain slicking the pavement beneath them. Halfway down the block, the wheel caught on a crack. Metal screamed. The chair tipped. Daniel hit the ground hard, pain ripping through his useless legs. "Aisha, don't stop," he gasped. "Take him, please." She froze for half a second that felt like betrayal. Then Noah let out a thin, terrifying sound, and the choice was made for her. Aisha scooped the baby into her arms and ran. She didn't remember the streets. She didn't remember the cars honking or the way her lungs burned. She only remembered bursting through the emergency room doors, soaked and shaking, shouting for help, like the world owed her nothing but mercy. Nurses rushed in. Someone took Noah from her arms. The doors closed. Silence. Minutes later, hours maybe. Aisha was back outside, breathless heart still racing. Daniel lay where she'd left him, rain dripping down his face, his broken wheelchair twisted beside him. Shame burned through him hotter than the pain. He couldn't move, couldn't help, couldn't even protect his own child. "I'm here," Aisha said softly, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled as she touched his shoulder. "I didn't leave. I had to save him first." Daniel closed his eyes. A single tear slipped free. Inside the hospital, Noah was stabilized. A doctor said the words pneumonia and critical, and just in time. Outside, Aisha borrowed a phone, called for help no one was obligated to give, and waited beside Daniel until an ambulance finally arrived. That night, as machines breathed for Noah and bandages wrapped Daniel's bruised body, one truth became impossible to ignore. They had reached the edge of loss. And somehow, through exhaustion, fear, and impossible choices, Aisha had carried them back from it. The offer came quietly, almost politely, in the sterile glow of the hospital hallway. A man in an expensive coat stepped out of the shadows, his shoes too clean for a place like this. Victor Hale, One of the men who had taken everything from Daniel smiled as if they were old friends. He glanced at the machines keeping Noah alive, then at Daniel slumped in his wheelchair, smaller than he had ever been. "This doesn't have to be so hard," Victor said, lowering his voice. "You're broken. The baby is fragile. Let the state take him. Walk away." He turned to Aisha and held out an envelope, thick, heavy. $50,000, he continued smoothly. "Enough to disappear. Start over. You owe him nothing." The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Aisha stared at the envelope, then slowly looked up at Victor. Her hands were still shaking from fear, from exhaustion, from the night she almost lost everything. But her voice when she spoke was steady. "You think this is about money?" she asked. Victor's smile faltered. Aisha took the envelope, felt its weight for half a second, then dropped it at his feet. The sound echoed. "I watched this man lose his legs," she said quietly. "I watched him lose his home, his name, his pride. And still he held on to his son like that was the only truth left in the world. You don't get to buy your way out of what you did." People had stopped walking. Nurses, visitors, everyone watching. Victor's face hardened. "You'll regret this." Aisha stepped closer, her eyes burning. "No, you will." Daniel had been silent the entire time, his fists clenched, his heart pounding with a rage he hadn't felt since before the accident. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. "You forgot something," he said hoarsely. "You thought I lost everything." Victor turned. Daniel met his gaze. "You missed the part where I was watching, listening, remembering." Security approached. Victor backed away, his confidence cracking. As he disappeared down the hallway, Aisha knelt beside Daniel, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We're not done," she whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by machines' fear and the thin line between life and death, Daniel realized something powerful had shifted. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of a fight. The plan began in whispers stitched together in the quiet hours after midnight, when fear finally loosened its grip. Daniel sat beside Noah's hospital bed, the steady beep of machines syncing with his breathing. Aisha stood near the window, arms crossed, listening, as Daniel spoke, not like a broken man anymore, but like the strategist he had once been. "They didn't erase me," he said softly. "They just assumed I was finished." Hidden beneath the old estate, behind a wall, no blueprint ever showed, was a private server Daniel had built years ago, back when trust still felt dangerous. It held everything: recordings, forged signatures, offshore transfers, proof, insurance. The reason Victor Hale had rushed to silence him instead of finishing the job. But Daniel couldn't retrieve it. Aisha could. "You don't have to," Daniel said, his voice tight. "Once you walk back in there, you're not invisible anymore." Aisha met his eyes. "I stopped being invisible the moment I stayed." The night she returned to the mansion, the house looked the same, perfect, cold, unforgiving. Security lights swept the lawn like watchful eyes. Aisha's heart hammered as she slipped inside through a service entrance she'd once used to carry laundry. Now she carried everything. Inside the study, her hands shook as she found the hidden panel. Footsteps echoed above her. Voices. Too close. Then darkness. Across the city, Daniel sat in a parked car, his fingers hovering over a switch. He hesitated only once before cutting the power to the entire block. Alarms screamed. Guards shouted. Chaos bloomed. Aisha ran. She burst out the back gate just as headlights swung toward her. A car screeched to a stop. The door flew open. "Get in," a woman snapped. Elena Sterling, Victor's oldest rival and Daniel's last call. They drove off as the mansion drowned in sirens. Hours later, Aisha placed the hard drive into Daniel's hands. He stared at it, overwhelmed not by the data, but by the woman who had walked straight into danger for him. "This ends now," he said. And for the first time since the accident, Daniel Cross didn't feel powerless. He felt ready. The truth didn't explode. It unfolded. Under crystal chandeliers and soft orchestral music, the city's most powerful men and women gathered for the annual charity gala, champagne in hand, cameras flashing, smiles rehearsed. Victor Hale, stood at the podium, polished and confident, speaking about integrity and leadership, as if the words belonged to him. That was when Aisha Monroe walked in. She didn't wear wealth. She wore resolve. No one noticed her at first, not until she reached the control table near the stage. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they had ever been. She met Daniel's eyes across the room. He gave the smallest nod. Aisha plugged in the drive. The screen behind Victor flickered. Then the room fell silent. Voices echoed through the speakers. Victor's voice, laughing, signing off on forged documents. Video followed dates, timestamps, signatures. Bank transfers lighting up the screen like a confession written in numbers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones rose, faces drained of color. Victor turned, panic cracking his smile. "This is a mistake," he stammered. Then a wheelchair rolled forward. Daniel Cross emerged from the shadows, his presence heavier than any standing man in the room. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. "I trusted you," he said quietly into a microphone that carried his pain to every corner of the hall. "And you took everything while I couldn't even stand." Police moved in before Victor could take another breath. Handcuffs clicked. Flashbulbs exploded. The empire that had crushed a broken man collapsed in real time. But Daniel wasn't watching Victor. He was watching Aisha. She stood there, surrounded by wealth that once ignored her, her face calm, eyes wet but unafraid. The woman who had pushed him through rain, who had sold her memories to keep his son alive, who had walked into a lion's den with nothing but truth in her hands. As Victor was led away, Daniel felt something lift, not just justice, but weight. The kind that buries men alive. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. And it had been carried on the shoulders of a woman who refused to let him disappear. The morning after the gala did not arrive with applause or headlines inside the small circle that mattered most. It arrived quietly with pale sunlight slipping through tall windows and the soft sound of a child breathing in sleep. Daniel sat in his wheelchair by the edge of the garden, watching his son rest in a crib placed near the open doors. The world outside was waking up unaware that his life had already crossed a line it could never return from. The fortune was coming back. The company would be his again. Courts, statements, interviews, those things would come soon. But none of them mattered as much as the woman standing a few steps away holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Aisha looked different now. Not because of the dress she had worn the night before or the diamonds borrowed for a single evening, but because she no longer carried fear in her shoulders. The fight was over. The survival mode that had kept her standing through hunger, rain, and humiliation was finally loosening its grip. "I don't know how to live when I'm not fighting," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind in the trees. Daniel turned to her. "Then don't live without purpose," he replied. "Live with us." He told her what he had been holding back since the night she sold her last piece of her past for his child's future. That he didn't want to rebuild an empire alone. That power without loyalty meant nothing. That the home he was reclaiming would be empty if she walked away from it. "I don't want you as my employee," he said, steady but raw. "I don't want gratitude or obligation. I want partnership. I want you to be Leo's mother in every way that counts. And if one day you can look at me and see more than a man you once saved, then I want to spend my life earning your love." Aisha knelt in front of him, her eyes shining, her hands trembling as they rested on his knees. "I stayed," she whispered, "because you were good when you had no reason to be. I stayed because love showed up before comfort ever did." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. No crowd, no cameras, just truth. Months later, the mansion no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt alive. Toys scattered across marble floors, laughter echoed where silence once ruled. Daniel worked again, but differently. Programs for single mothers, scholarships, jobs that gave dignity instead of charity. And every evening, as the sun set behind the garden, Aisha would walk barefoot through the grass with Leo in her arms, while Daniel watched, finally understanding the deepest victory of all. He hadn't just reclaimed his life, he had found his home. Years later, when the headlines had faded and the scandal became history, the real ending of Daniel and Aisha's story lived far away from courtrooms and board meetings. It lived in ordinary mornings. Daniel would sit on the porch with a mug of cooling coffee, his laptop closed, watching Leo chase butterflies across the lawn. Aisha's laughter carried through the air, unforced, free, no longer shaped by fear or survival. The mansion still stood tall, but it no longer symbolized power. It symbolized shelter, healing, second chances. Daniel had rebuilt his company, but not in the image it once had. He hired people others overlooked. He protected workers the way Aisha once protected him. And when reporters asked what changed him, he never spoke about betrayal or victory. He spoke about loyalty, about a woman who pushed his wheelchair through rain when everyone else drove past, about love that showed up without contracts, without guarantees, without safety nets, about the truth that the strongest people are often the ones the world underestimates the most. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Aisha sat beside him, Leo asleep in her arms. Daniel reached for her hand, not as a man asking to be saved, but as one finally standing firm in who he had become. "We survived," he said. "No," Aisha replied softly. "We chose each other, and that made all the difference." This story reminds us that real wealth is not money, power, or status. It is loyalty. When things fall apart, courage. When walking away would be easier, and love that stays when there is nothing left to gain. In real life, the people who save us rarely wear crowns. They wear patience, sacrifice, and quiet strength. Never underestimate the value of standing by someone when the world turns its back. And never forget the way you treat people when you are broken reveals who you truly are. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What part touched your heart the most? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that remind us what truly matters in life.